Good evening and welcome to 365 Days of Stories with Theo Mayer. Amazing stories. Today we are on day 89 and I'm going to be telling you the story called Give It Your All. So, once there was a seasoned merchant. He used to carry goods across a large desert, expansive desert, with a string of camels, typically, that were laden with goods. Now, the desert is a interesting, sometimes barren, and sometimes dangerous expanse to cross. When you're traveling with animals and people, of course, there are a couple of things that are very important. One is water. Second is staying sheltered from the elements. If you're sheltered from the elements, then you tend to need less water. But deserts, why are they deserts? Typically because there's a lack of water. So each time the merchant would cross the desert, typically heading into Morocco from some southern area, he would bring with him a guide who knew how to travel via the stars, just as if you were crossing an ocean. In this case, it was a sea of sand. And the navigator would need to know how to get from one place to another and would need to be quite diligent in getting this long train of animals and people from one water source to the next. So on this particular journey, the merchant had found, of course, beautiful goods from one part of the world, and was now going to transport them to another part of the world and sell them for a profit. And he'd been doing this for quite a number of years. He was quite good at it, had a beautiful eye for picking out exquisite things that people not only could use, but that people would want. And so he had gathered all these things together and put them into the baskets that were carried on either side of the camel. And he had camel drivers and men who would cook when they were out. And, everyone there was needed in order to perform the various tasks that it would take in order to bring those animals across the desert and the people as well in a healthy fashion. And of course, there was the navigator. Well, they set off, and their journey was going to take them 8 days to get from the one side of the desert to the other. And there were oases where there was water and typically shelter as well. And so the camel train started. The merchant, he was quite delighted and quite excited by this prospect of, gaining more wealth for himself and his family and friends. And, he enjoyed that wealth, not only for himself, but also enjoyed making other people happy by giving what excess he could to others. And so off they go. And they've traveled from one oasis to another, to another, to another, night after night. They traveled at night. Why? Because it was too hot during the daytime. And the navigator, it was really very easy to travel at night because he could follow the stars. And so they had one more night of travel to go, and they would be at their destination. Now, I don't know how many of you have gone off camping, say, for days on end, and slept on the ground and, cooked your meals outside and done all those wonderful things. But there is often a fatigue that sets in after so many days of traveling like that, so many days of sleeping on the ground, and you're so happy to get back to what you'd consider a little bit more normal, softer bed, easier everything. And so everybody was beginning to feel that. And the merchant definitely was, and the navigator was as well. On that last night of traveling, the navigator's out at the head of the line of animals, and he got to night dreaming about being back at home and being in a warm bed and being next to his wife and just being at home. And as he began to envision all of this, he got drowsier and drowsier. And now, the riding back and forth on a camel, and camels tend to sway a little bit from side to side as they walk, not like a horse, which is much more backward and forward. And as he's swaying back and forth, he's beginning to get tired. His eyes begin to half close, and pretty soon he's fallen asleep. Now there's no one to head that first camel. And the camel just begins to go on its own way. Now, it's a very interesting thing, but if you jump in the water and you just start swimming, say you're swimming across the ocean, you tend to curve a little bit to one side. If you're walking, in a forest, let's say, and you're walking along, you tend to curve a little bit one side or the other. The camel was no different. It did not walk a straight path. It began to curve. And it curved and curved. Now, the merchant was still awake. He had not fallen asleep, and he thought the navigator had everything, all taken care of. And so the whole train of animals is riding on and on, walking on and on. And nobody knows what's going on because everyone trusts the navigator is guiding the entire line of animals and people. Well, dawn is coming. It begins to get light from the east, and the merchant has been wondering, just because he has some ability to read the stars as well, he's been wondering where the heck are they going? It seems like they're a little bit off, but he trusts the navigator, but he decides he better go up and just make sure that they're on course, because he thought by this time their destination would be in sight, the walls of this beautiful city that they were traveling to, and they would know that their journey was at its end. Now, the one thing that it's very important to do as you travel across the desert is, you tend to carry water along, from one oasis to the next, just to make sure that you get there and everything is well hydrated. The merchant, which was common practice in order to save on weight on that final night of travel, he had not filled up all of the water vessels. He had filled up a minimal amount so that they would be able to travel faster and lighter. with the goods that they had. Well, it turns out that that line of animals was completely off course. The merchant got to the navigator and he was slumped over, his head slumped over, and he was asleep. And he nudged the navigator into wakefulness, and the navigator sprung to alertness and looked up and looked around and could see where they were going immediately by the position of the stars. And the words that he spoke out were an exclamation and a pleading to God, or Allah in this case, that he would have mercy on them, because they were way off course and very, very far from their destination at this point. In fact, they were just about as far from their destination when the merchant came up to the navigator as they were when they started off the beginning of that night. Well, the merchant, having done this many, many times, he immediately called a halt to the train of animals. And as the sun was getting closer and closer to coming up, he immediately had tents staked out, animals put in shelter, what water there was distributed amongst the animals, and he was very, very worried. Now they were in a bit of a desperate situation, because in order to make that last day's journey to where they needed to get to, he knew both the men and the animals would need that water, because maybe one animal or some men would begin to have trouble, and as some of them had trouble, it could turn into the whole train of animals and people having trouble as they went along. He wasn't feeling very good about it. Once everything was kind of settled, tents were up, the sun came up, and the sun was blaring down on them, and it was pretty hot. Now I'll leave the story there, and we'll find out what happens next tomorrow. Okay. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks for joining.